Can American banks do business in Canada? Donald Trump really seems to think Canadians are constantly ripping Americans off, and he's now made a strange claim about Canada's banking sector, at least 3 times now, by my count. Most recently, on Truth Social, he said, Canada doesn't allow American banks to do business in Canada. That's basically what he posted a month earlier as well. Canada doesn't even allow US banks to open or do business there. What's that all about? And he's made this claim to reporters, too.
You know, we're not treated well by Canada, and we have to be treated well. Banks are not, as an example, allowed. Did you know that American banks are not allowed to do business in Canada? Can you believe that?
Now, it would be hard to believe the President of the United States, with a cabinet packed with Wall Street experience, could simply be mistaken on something so plainly wrong, considering he said it at least 3 times over the span of a month. So I'm going to say it's possible Donald Trump is just plain lying, because there are 16 US-owned banks operating in Canada, all of them headquartered in Toronto, managing more than $100 billion worth of assets. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citi, JP Morgan. They're among the many US banks financing mortgages, handling investments, offering credit cards, and lending money to businesses in Canada. A company like JP Morgan, they've got hundreds of employees in Canada, and Citibank has been here for more than 100 years?
President Trump's claim that U.S. banks can't operate in Canada is absolutely incorrect.
His allegations are inaccurate.
That's just obviously not true.
Foreign banks are not barred from operating in Canada.
But here's the point where we unravel the lie to try to answer a more difficult question, which is, what is Trump getting at? Like, what grievance of his is driving the lie? Because even if what Trump says at any given moment is demonstrably false, he may still have a point. It only takes the most superficial of looks at Canada's banking sector to at least raise the question, what is going on here? According to the Canadian Bankers Association, there are 79 banks operating in Canada, foreign and domestic. They manage more than $5 trillion within the country. But you know the big 6, Royal Bank, TD, Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, and National Bank, how much they're responsible for? Almost 80%, and they're all Canadian owned. This is very difficult to go up against.
Getting access to the retail banking market in Canada has been the top priority of no banking executive ever.
Now, there may be different reasons for this. Trump seems to be suggesting Canada's rules for American companies are what make it unfair.
We are quite heavily regulated, our financial institutions here in Canada.
If a U.S. bank wants to open up shop in Canada, they really have 2 pathways.
Yeah, the moment a U.S. bank decides to set up shop in Canada, there is an immediate fork in the road. Do you want to open a subsidiary, or do you want to open a branch? Opening a subsidiary is like opening a whole new legal entity, incorporated in Canada. It can still be owned by Americans, but it's subject to the full force of Canadian regulations, which, in some pretty important ways, are more strict than what you find in the States.
So for every dollar that a bank loans out to someone, they have to keep some money on hand so that they can have another dollar in case somebody decides to withdraw their dollar. So Canadian banks have traditionally been subject to some stricter rules.
The advantage of jumping through all of Canada's hoops, though, which all domestic banks have to do too, by the way, is that you get to be the real deal. A full-fledged Canadian bank, doing all the things that you can imagine regular banks do. Welcome to the big leagues. ICICI Bank is a big Indian multinational that's gone this route. And on the American side, there are 3 banks that have become subsidiaries as well. Amex, JP Morgan, and Citibank. But most foreign-owned banks that do business in Canada don't take this route.
If you decide to open a subsidiary, then you have to compete with the big 6 banks who have their branches on every corner.
It's very difficult to get a Canadian customer to switch to another bank. There's so much brand loyalty that goes into this.
We are doing more for you at the Bank of Montreal. Get us working for you, CIBC.
It's costly, right? Like, it's not an efficient way to operate, right? Full capital, full liquidity, full governance, all those kinds of requirements that you would need.
So the alternative is to forget trying to open a subsidiary. Too expensive, too daunting. Let's open a branch instead. That model is a bit more like dipping a toe rather than cannonballing into the pool.
If you're running a branch, your regulatory requirements are going to be primarily your home country's regulatory requirements. You still have regulatory requirements in Canada, but they're not the same level of requirement.
That means you get to skip the complexity of incorporating in Canada and the additional regulations that come with that. And it's as close as you can get to managing your branch more like a simple extension of your US operations.
If you stay connected to that tree, if you're just a foreign bank branch, then you can take advantage of the scale of your massive American bank, something like Citibank, as opposed to just being a small Canadian subsidiary trying to compete against big Canadian banks on their home turf.
There's a big drawback, though, which really limits what a foreign-owned branch can do. Canadian rules dictate they cannot take client deposits under $150,000.
And that means you're largely barred from operating in the lucrative retail banking space. So you can't offer products like checking and savings accounts to get that everyday Canadian customer.
So I'm just a regular guy, I get paid, I want to deposit my paycheck into a foreign-owned branch account. It's not allowed. And that's a big part of retail banking.
Sure. Yeah, like that's most of us. That's almost all of us, almost all the time, right? But it's not where the money is.
Yes, and this is an important point. Most American banks operating in Canada accept this drawback because to go the other route of having front desks, tellers, ATMs, trying to be on every street corner, why fight to take in dollars individually from people like you and me when you could focus instead on wealthier clients or corporate clients and take those dollars in by the millions?
It's not necessarily where the money is, depending on your banking model. We are millions of tiny chihuahuas that you have to herd to a local bank branch and keep organized, as opposed to a couple big Great Dane clients that are going to produce better returns for you.
And now we're zeroing in on perhaps the single biggest reason American banks in Canada just do not operate at the scale of Canadian banks. And it's not, as Trump suggests, because they can't.
Where President Trump is correct is that Canadian banks have managed to grow and establish a strong foothold in the US market. But in a lot of ways, that has less to do with the regulatory framework and more to do with market dynamics.
If he's talking about the laws and regulations, there's just really no foundation to saying that the Canadian banking landscape is unfair to American banks. They can do whatever they want here as Canadian subsidiaries if they decide to do that.
And one more thing, this additional claim Trump makes that what's unfair is that Canadian banks flood the American market, that's just not true at all. Here are the top 10 banks in the US. The first thing you should notice is that they're almost all American owned. The one exception is TD, but even then, at number 10 on the list, they're about 3% of the top 10 pie by assets.
So it's not the case that Canadian banks have flooded the American market.
So here's the bottom line. Can you make the argument that restrictions here in Canada prevent full competition between domestic and foreign banks? Yeah, the facts say you can, but the bigger reason we don't have American banks on every street corner probably has more to do with market forces than regulation. And American banks do operate here, handling billions of dollars. So back to Trump's original claim that Canada doesn't allow US banks to open or do business here, that's just wrong.